Yeah, well, let me speak to that question of TPP, which of course is an initiative that was not started by the United States. TPP goes back to the P4 countries, which is Chile, Brunei, Singapore, and New Zealand. So TPP has a long history as P4. So many people talk about this as an American initiative, or that the Americans are driving this agreement and trying to balance against China. I think that's fundamentally misleading. I think that TPP came out of the idea of this P4, and the P4 countries were trying to achieve a broad-based agreement that went beyond the traditional tariffs and quotas to do behind-the-border activities. So this included things beyond subsidies and so on, but also included things like government procurement, regulatory standards, IP protection, and the like. So I think the fact that if you look at Singapore or New Zealand or Chile, all very open countries, they were the ones that were driving this accord. Now, when the United States decided to join TPP, it started using TPP as the vehicle for its interests in the Asia-Pacific. In part, that is because APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, has really not been very successful in promoting free trade, which was its original mandate going back to 1989. Now, if you look at APEC, APEC is in some sense searching for a role, and the US did try to use APEC, and in fact one of the original ideas was to use APEC as a forum for trade negotiations. And one of my friends, Fred Bergston, who's at the Institute for International Economics, actually advocated that FTA be created, Free Trade Area of the Asia Pacific, and that APEC would be the vehicle to do so. I actually wrote a very critical piece against that notion, which was published by PEC, Pacific Economic Cooperation Council, arguing that that was a bit naive. And the reason I thought it was naive was not because I'm against free trade in the Asia Pacific, because I think free trade in the Asia Pacific is a very important thing. It's because I did not think that APEC had the institutional capacity to serve in that role. So it was not a matter of some people misinterpreted what I said as I'm against open trade. That's not the issue. The issue is the practicality of it. And the practicality is that APEC is not a negotiating forum. It's not set up that way. Its secretariat is very small, and countries have never really negotiated an APEC on a large-scale basis beyond its working parties. So this is just by way of providing some background up to what was going on. So you do see TPP becoming the American initiative, and I think in some sense it made a lot of sense, because what you had is, I should preface that by saying I'm basically against all of these regional agreements. I think they're a bad idea. I think we should try to go back to the WTO, the World Trade Organization, as the major forum for trade liberalization. I'm also a pragmatist. I think that's not happening. I think there's some reasons why progress has not been made in the WTO. But I just want to preface it by saying I don't particularly endorse any of these initiatives, whether they're TPP or RCEP or any of these agreements. I think really countries should be focusing on the WTO, and maybe we can come back to that later in further questions. But turning further to TPP, so when TPP was initiated, of course it was a small number of countries, as I said before, that it began to expand. And once the US decided to join TPP, I think that created some excitement among other Asian countries, particularly those who are interested in trade liberalization, that this was going to be a high standard agreement which would include a lot of issues that are of concern to them. And as we know, a lot of the issues in trade are now behind the border issues. They're not simply border issues, and those are the issues that are very important. Now, RCEP, which of course is a very important initiative as well, is really ASEAN plus 6 countries, including Australia, New Zealand, and India, and China, Japan, Korea, CJK countries. So I think that's another important initiative, and there's been efforts to move forward there as well. But they're fundamentally different beasts, if you'd like, right? So RCEP is going to be a relatively low standard agreement dealing with the kinds of issues that have been dealt with in the WTO, that have been dealt with in ASEAN and other kinds of things, but it really doesn't go behind the border to address a lot of these issues. And I know that there was a lot of talk about this is a US strategy balanced against China, and China is balancing against the US. And I've told American officials that this is completely silly, right? I mean, go ahead and ask China to join TPP. That was what I advocated more than a year ago, and they were appalled that I suggested this. And I said, it's very simple. China can't join TPP, not because the US is blocking them, but because China simply is unwilling to follow what TPP would require. So I think this new initiative by China is actually probably only diplomatic in nature, but the reality is China is not about to give up government procurement. It has never signed the Government Procurement Code, which it agreed to sign when it joined the WTO in 2001. It's been going on for 11 years. And as many of my students have written about, and including what the work I've done with Simon Evnett, we've shown systematically that the Chinese have used government procurement and other regulatory policy as an instrument of industrial policy. So the reason I said to my colleagues in the United States, I said, just go ahead and ask China to join the TPP, is because they won't be able to meet any of the standards. If China could meet the standards of TPP, they should be welcome. All countries should be welcome to join TPP. But the reality is that China will not be able to meet the requirements of TPP without significantly transforming TPP into what it's not. So I think this is an interesting initiative. I believe in these kinds of diplomatic forays. The US has also talked about joining RCEP. The US can join RCEP much more easily than China can join TPP. So this is not about balancing behavior and realist behavior or anything like that. It's about the practicalities of what is in the agreement. And the reason, in fact, even the US was against Canada and Mexico joining TPP was simply because some of these countries like Canada and Mexico were not abiding by some of the things the US was interested in getting rid of, including state procurement and so on in certain industries. So the very notion that this is somehow an anti-Chinese effort is very silly, because the initiative was not American to start with. It was an initiative of other countries. The US joined this initiative. The US, of course, has become the driver of a lot of these things in TPP. And so I don't think that the reason that China was not getting into TPP was because of massive American opposition or anything like that. It's because the Chinese realistically have trouble joining. If the US was opposing Mexico and Canada, its two staunch allies and part of North America, how can one imagine that somehow the US is against China when it's already blocking Mexico and Canada? Now Mexico and Canada now have joined TPP and negotiations are proceeding. But even on Japan, for example, the US is very reluctant to have Japan joining because people are worried about the auto sector in the United States. So TPP also is, there is American protectionism. American interests don't like all these countries joining, and so they are worried about new competitors, just like in Korea they worry about beef, and in other countries they worry about other things. So every country has its domestic political interests who are concerned about these agreements. So to summarize, I think in an ideal world, what will happen is that RCEP will become a forum where you have a relatively low standard agreement, broad-based, covering lots of issues, and TPP will be a higher standard agreement where they will move beyond border issues to behind the border issues and deal with things like government procurement, state trading companies, and the like, which are really the major impediment to having more of a level playing field. I don't say a level playing field because that's naive, but I think if you want more of a level playing field in the global economy, you cannot have state-owned enterprises who are not interested in the profit motive or are backed by the government. They're interested in profits, but the government backs them. You can't have individual provinces pursuing industrial policy as they do in China, in the auto sector. You can't go on and do this and expect that everyone's going to be happy with the outcome. So the reality is that TPP will probably proceed. I doubt China will be asked to really participate because, in fact, the Obama administration is interested in getting this round to conclude. And it's been going on for year and year after year after year. It's already very complicated. There are lots of issues in this agreement. China would simply slow the whole thing down. I think it's important to keep in mind that, yes, European integration was a lot. European trade integration was about security, right? So if you look at 1951 and the creation of the European Coal and Steel Community, which was the forerunner to the European Economic Community in 1957, that was about trying to preserve peace in Europe. And we saw that there was a great role played by the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg, in addition to Italy, France, and Germany. And of course, there were territorial disputes that had been taking place between Alsace-Lorraine, over Alsace-Lorraine, between France and Germany. So I don't think that territorial disputes per se will negate the ability to move forward on trade. But you also have to remember the context of European integration. And here one has to keep in mind that European integration, when it took place in the context of the Cold War. So it was about France and Germany trying to cooperate together and trying to get some cooperation, but heavily backed by the United States. And so I don't know if you're familiar with the story, but in fact, when the European Coal and Steel Community was first formed, the Czechoslovakians challenged this in the GATT as being inconsistent with Article 24 of the GATT. And the reason that was considered to be inconsistent is that Article 24 of the GATT specifically says that you cannot have a regional trade agreement that is sector specific. So it must cover substantially all trade. And that was a very important provision in the GATT going back to 1947. So when the European Coal and Steel Community was first vetted and people were looking at this, the Czechoslovakians filed this complaint in the GATT saying that this was inconsistent with Article 24. Now, the American position at that point was very clear. Despite the fact that clearly the European Coal and Steel Committee was inconsistent with Article 24 by its very name. It's coal and steel, so one can tell immediately that's a sector-based agreement, two sectors, coal and steel. The United States simply asked for a waiver of obligation, which meant that the Europeans would be allowed to proceed with integration. And by 1957, when their agreement covered substantially all trade, then it became consistent with the GATT. So there is, in this sense, a kind of trade security nexus, and the US was very concerned with the security matters, that is, resisting the Soviet Union. So it wanted the French and Germans to stop beating each other over the head and fighting with each other, as they had done in multiple times over the last 200 years, and focus on the real threat in the American view, and also maybe the European view, which is the Soviet Union. By integrating in Europe, that would then allow this grouping of the European countries to be more resistant to communist incursion. So there was a very clear security context within which this took place. So it's a different context. In some sense, these three countries have to work out all this Dr. Takeshima and Senkaku-Deyu and all these other island disputes themselves, whether they can simply put those on the back burner, as might be a reasonable strategy, move forward with trade integration, and maybe through some kind of cooperation that will help them to take these disputes, maybe resolve them through, International Court of Justice, or have independent arbitration, divide up the islands. I mean, I'm not an expert to comment on what should be done about any of these islands. My colleague Mingyo Ku, my former student, has written about island disputes and these problems and looking at economic interdependence. He's the expert on island disputes. But I think these island disputes are standing in the way, quite clearly, of integration. They need not stand in the way. But I think the fact is that territorial disputes in Europe were really nested with this much broader, bigger security context, so that in fact it paled in comparison to the bigger security picture. So I think one can't equate the two things. People often say, well, why can't the Chinese and Japanese get along after all the Germans and French get along after years and years? I think that's true to some extent, but the context is very important. It's not that the Germans and the French just started cooperating after World War II because they changed their mind. It's because it was in a bigger security context where there was a lot of external pressure coming about because of the Cold War. So I think I'm optimistic that you can have a CJK agreement. I think this leads to a situation where you need to have policymakers willing to essentially de-link issues, right? And I talk in my work about linking issues, but delinking issues is also very important. So what you need to really do here, if you want to move on CJK, is say, look, we do have a trade dispute over islands, but that doesn't mean that we cannot have a trade agreement, right? So if policymakers, generally in Professor Mingyo Ku's work, for domestic political reasons, want to stir up trouble about islands, then you're really going to be in a situation where that will undermine the prospects for a free trade agreement. So what these policymakers have to do is behave in a more adult fashion. Stop linking all of these issues together and simply say, yes, we have a problem on Senkaku-Deyu, we have a problem in Dr. Takeshima, but that does not mean that we cannot have a free trade agreement among ourselves, and we'll continue to have some disputes over these islands, but we can still move forward on a trade agreement. So this kind of delinkage, in some cases, is really the way to proceed forward, instead of simply saying, let's negotiate about everything. And that's what I was saying about some of this trade security nexus. We should not overplay the linkage, right? Sometimes it makes sense. Of course, we understand that trade has a lot of security implications, but I can't imagine that a CJK agreement will really affect the sovereignty of these islands that are in dispute, right? So you could really have a trade agreement, and it will not, and there can still be a dispute over trade, over the islands, right? So my view is simply go ahead and have disputes over the islands if you really want to, but you can still move forward with a trade agreement. So that's my view on how one might proceed, and I think the key concept here is delinkage. I guess Asia can just stay behind, right, in some sense, right? So the Americans are moving forward with Europe, right, with a trade agreement, and they're negotiating their trade agreement. I don't think the French are unhappy about some things, but the negotiations are still proceeding. So I think one can sit around and link everything and hope that everything gets resolved and use all sorts of power in FTAs, or one can simply say, let's be realistic about the world, and trade agreements are proceeding in other parts of the world, and the US is now negotiating with the EU. And so if the US negotiates with the EU and sets global standards, the Chinese will be very unhappy. And so will the Japanese, and so will the Koreans. Because after all, what's going to happen in the EU-US agreement, it's not about tariffs. Tariffs, average tariff between the US and EU is so tiny, because average tariffs in manufacturing goods are tiny, except for maybe textiles and apparel trade, which is not very important, crucially, between the United States and EU. What's really important in the EU-US relationship is all of these behind-the-border issues about regulation, health standards, safety standards, government aid to industry, all of these issues. And the most important thing in the new global economy is regulation, setting standards. Okay, if you set telecom standards, if you set standards for other products, if those standards are set in the EU-US forum, given the size of multinational corporations in the US and Europe, given the fact that Japanese and even Chinese and Indian multinational corporations are also operating in Europe and the United States, if those standards are set between two powers, then China, Japan, and Korea continue to argue for the next 100 years about we don't want to have a forum until we agree on all the issues, but the standards will be set. So I think there they will learn the unfortunate lesson that the world moves forward without you. Right? And so I think here, I can't tell Chinese leaders what to do, or Japanese or Korean leaders. I'm not in that position. My only advice to them is, if you want to link everything and you want to resolve all the issues at once, it may take you a very long time. And so therefore what will happen is you will fall behind in a lot of these standard setting issues. And already in OECD, there's criticism of a lot of state-owned enterprises. And pretty soon what we'll see is a lot of rise of protectionism possibly against China, as we've seen in the United States, as we've seen in the EU. And after all, you know, the EU is having lots of economic troubles, but the EU is one of the world's largest markets, largest GDP in the world as a region, and the US, and these are very big regions, and you want to be able to participate in standard setting. And I think if you don't participate in standard, it will be Japan, China, and Korea's loss. So I appreciate that the Chinese or the Japanese or the Koreans or whatever may want to settle all their disputes all at once. But I think if you overload trade with too many issues, you end up not moving forward on any of the issues, which is actually detrimental to the economies of all three countries. Right? So that's my own view on this. I mean, I'm not sure that these policymakers may not have different incentives, because these policymakers have political incentives. They want to stay in power. They want to show that they're tough. Chinese leaders who are new leaders want to show that they are in command. Japanese leaders want to show that Abe economics is working. So Korea has a new prime minister, president. So everybody is trying to show something for a domestic political reason. But the reality of it is that companies move on. Trade moves on, investment moves on, and you want to be part of the global game. That global game, as I mentioned earlier, would be better played at the WTO because there would be more participation by all of these countries. But in the absence of movement in the WTO, these standards will be set elsewhere. So it's really a simple question. Do you want to be part of the game or not part of the game? And if you're not part of the game and you keep arguing about other issues and say everything needs to be connected, you'll fall behind. That's my general view. Well, that's a complicated issue. Of course, you know, if you're not a big power, the world is not always kind to you, or if you're a middle power or a smaller power. But of course, that doesn't mean you are without power at all. And I think much more, we can see in Europe, for example, that the Benelux, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg played a key role in fostering cooperation between France and Germany. So I think there is that role that that can be played. People look to the European example. That example, of course, is over 60 years old. But let's look at a more recent example, which we talked about earlier, which is the P4. So when the P4 was created about 6 or 7 years ago, with this 4 countries, Chile, Brunei, New Zealand and Singapore, most people looked at this as a joke, right? And when I would talk about P4 at some conferences, people would say, that's very funny, ha ha, these 4 little countries, who do the Singaporeans think they are, who do the Chileans think they are, and so on, right? So you might have said, well, this is a completely silly thing, why are these countries taking this initiative? And these countries were interested in promoting open trade and free trade amongst themselves, but Singaporeans are not stupid. You can't accuse them of that. You can accuse them of many things. But they clearly were not seeking to create a hegemonic arrangement in Southeast Asia and across the Pacific with the other superpowers of the world, Chile, Brunei, and New Zealand. So their intention from the beginning was clear. They realized that there was a lack of progress in the WTO, that the WTO was stalled, that many of the issues that could potentially be addressed in the WTO had not been addressed adequately. And they explicitly talked about trying to play a leadership role, right? So Singapore is a much smaller country than Korea, both in population and size of economy and so on. And yet these 4 countries started to take this initiative. And then when the United States joined, people first thought the United States had gone crazy to join this kind of agreement with the 4 little countries. And then suddenly you have Australia, and then you have other countries joining, and one after the other, and then maybe China might join at some point, and then Japan wanted to join, and Mexico and Canada. So you really see here that small countries, not medium, not even middle countries, can play a very dynamic role, right? So if we think about international relations theory, and theory is very important because theory is a tool for grasping reality. So let's think about the theories. One theory is kind of realism, power-based theories that people talk about. My former colleague Kenneth Waltz talks about realism all the time, and realist thinking in his very interesting theory. And of course that plays gives very short shrift essentially to middle powers, right? If you're a middle power, if you're a small power, just be quiet. Balance or bandwagon, that's great, choose one of the 2, but essentially you are peripheral to the major power system. And the major power system is either US, Soviet Union, or maybe US, China, India, Brazil, a few of the big powers that we multipolar world. Okay, well that's one theory that you can use to think about the world. Another theory, of course, is constructivism, right? And constructivists or neoliberals talk about other things, other actors, actors like multinational corporations, the role of experts, the role of government policymakers in smaller countries who may have a better understanding of some issues. And I think these kinds of theories, both neoliberal theory as well as constructivist theory, can add insight into our understanding of how middle powers or small powers might act. And here one can see that the kinds of initiatives that they take, if they are ardent advocates of something that seems reasonable, that makes sense, that economically will lead to benefits for everyone, that's a non-zero-sum game, and not just a zero-sum game, those kinds of ideas can be accepted. If you look at the creation of APEC, it was not an American initiative, it was an Australian-Japanese initiative, right, going back to 1989. So we have seen time and again some of these arrangements were pushed by other countries and became accepted. Now, if you're Korea and you want credit, I would say don't count on it. Because one thing I've seen historically is that big powers like to take credit for other people's ideas. And here I can think even of the United States. So if you look at debt rescheduling, which is a little different than trade issues, but in the 1980s in debt rescheduling, when Latin American debt crisis was in full bloom, the Latin Americans were all having problems, the Miyazawa plan was proposed by the Japanese to write down debt for developing countries in Latin America. And the Americans poo-pooed it. And 2 years later, it was reinvented as the Brady Plan, and that became the basis for debt rescheduling in Latin America. So you could say, well, the Japanese should be very unhappy because their intellectual property was not protected. It wasn't. It was the Miyazawa Plan, and the Americans say, oh, the Brady Plan. But let's be realistic. So what I'm saying is, if you want outcomes, right, then you should not worry about intellectual ownership. But if the Koreans want to play a dynamic role in the economy, they should come up with initiatives that are helpful for Korea, obviously, that are helpful for the region, and that are helpful for the global economy. And some of these initiatives will be taken up, whether it's in the OECD, or the WTO, or other fora. But I must tell you, if you really want credit for these things, not you personally, but Korea or other countries, I can't guarantee that they'll be given suitable credit. So really, I think one has to think in terms of a long-term strategy of an outcome that's beneficial to Korea, that takes into account the reality of the global economy, which includes both the acceptance of new ideas, but also the rejection of giving people credit for these new ideas. So that's what I would say that Korea can do and play a very decisive role. And as we've seen in the global economy, there have been examples of this, from the creation of APEC to the creation of TPP. These are not initiatives of big countries. They did not, okay, Japan was a big country, but in fact Australia played a decisive role. And in the P4, of course, we've seen very small countries. So it is possible to use the intellectual force of argument to change the world. So I think similarly as a middle power, what you have to do is figure out what are your goals, what is important for you, what kind of initiatives will benefit Korea, and Korea will benefit from a nicer neighborhood. Nicer in the sense of a more peaceful neighborhood, without territorial disputes, with high economic growth, with inclusiveness and global equity, and all of the things that Korea is taking some initiative on. And I know Koreans are very interested now in thinking about inclusiveness and more global equity. We know that capitalism can create a lot of global inequity. Capitalism is a very efficient system, but people who are not highly educated, who are not trained and so on, often become losers from capitalism in the short run. So I think taking initiatives, understanding these issues, understanding environmental degradation, of which there are lots of environmental problems throughout Asia, these issues, if they're brought onto the agenda by middle powers, they can get accepted, they can get incorporated, and I think that's the way to really have influence. By definition, if you're a middle power, you can't coerce anybody into doing anything. If you're a small power, you have even less opportunity to coerce anybody. So really what you need is the force of intellect, the force of ideas, in being able to convince people that the world could be a better place if you paid attention to some of these new ideas. That's where I think middle powers can really make a difference in the global economy and help improve global living standards for everyone. Everybody wants to be the author, as we were talking about, take credit for some particular institutional arrangement. So the Australians have to have their initiative, and the Koreans want their initiative, and the Japanese have their initiative, and people don't focus on what really needs to be done, which is, you're trying to liberalize trade or investment or improve the environment or have more inclusive growth. So there is this kind of view of institutions that there's too much proliferation and everybody wants to have them. Here I differ with my colleague, T.J. Pempel, who's at Berkeley, and he wrote a very interesting article where he said that we should not worry about the proliferation of institutions, because in an evolutionary fashion, the ones that are most successful will remain. I like his sentiment. I disagree with his analysis. And the reason I disagree with that analysis is because, unfortunately, institutions, particularly regional or international institutions, have a way of never going away. And my favorite but my favorite institution that never went away is the BIS, the Bank for International Settlements, which is, of course, a very important institution today because it's where central bankers coordinate on monetary policy and on exchange rate policy. So they actually do a lot of coordination in Basel and Switzerland. But if you look at the history of BIS, you will see that it started as an organization to deal with German war reparations. Well, if you think about that, it's rather ironic. After 1933, Germans were not paying war reparations after Hitler had come to power. So you would have thought that the BIS would disappear. But bureaucrats have a way of inventing work for themselves. And so they never want any institution to go away, right? So what you get instead is not a natural evolutionary model, which T.J. Pempel might like, but doesn't work, of natural selection. Because there's no selection process taking place. The environment is not so hostile that only the fittest survive, right? The model of evolution, it has to have variation in species, which is caused by genetic anomalies of various kinds, and then you have to have an environment within which those that are more successful are selected. Simple biology. Well, that's not the case in the international institutional flora and fauna. What we see instead is that institutions are created, they keep hanging around, right? I'm a great fan of APEC. I run an APEC study center. At some point, APEC may well be obsolete, right? Because if you have RCEP, if you have TPP, and if you have the WTO revived, is there a role for APEC? How many people think APEC will disappear? I don't think it'll disappear. How many people think RCEP will be absorbed by TPP, which would make sense because if all the members of RCEP join TPP, and TPP is a bigger negotiation, then RCEP will disappear. But what do we have instead? We have ASEAN plus 3 initiatives, we have ASEAN plus 6 initiatives, we have various other kinds of fora in which these things are being discussed. So it's not simply a matter of wasting money, which of course is very important. It's a matter of the fundamental problem of what I've called nested institutions. And when you have nesting of institutions, you want to make sure that there's a reconciliation between higher level or broader based institutions like the WTO and institutions within that. So you may have WTO, then within that you kind of have APEC, and then you have TPP. But what happens? Pretty soon their membership becomes different, right? All members of TPP I think they're currently all members of APEC, but that maybe their members will come who are not members of APEC. And so what you get is you get this kind of institutional mishmash. Now, what's the problem with having an institutional mishmash besides the waste of money? The biggest problem is from the corporate perspective, and particularly for small and medium enterprises. So I love it when government officials talk about how much they love small and medium enterprises. And this is the mantra of all government officials, whether they're Americans or Europeans or Japanese or Koreans. Everybody prays to small and medium enterprises as being the salvation of the global economy. What they don't realize is the agreements they're creating are detrimental to small and medium enterprises. Small and medium enterprises cannot keep track of all these agreements. They cannot keep track of the variation in sourcing policy, in regulatory policy, and so on. And I once was working with a company, a high-level American company, high-technology company, very big, and I was complaining to them that all of these agreements are detrimental. All this proliferation, noodle bowl or spaghetti bowl of free trade agreements is detrimental. And what this high-level executive told me, I remembered for many years. He said, Vinny, these are great agreements. And I said, why? He said, they're so complicated and so messy that this will give us a competitive edge with all the smaller companies. Because we can always hire someone like you or keep track of them on a computer. Now, since I do a little consulting, I was very happy he said we can hire you. But the reality is, for small and medium enterprises, they cannot keep track. If I am trying to run a small company, it's not really possible for me to focus on all of the government regulations and rules and procedures that have been developed in all these different agreements, right? If you're a big company, you can do that. So ironically, it's all about talk. When bureaucrats say they like small and medium enterprises, they don't really help them deal with these issues. If they really wanted to help them, they would say, here's a one-stop approach to understanding which agreements, which form you have to fill out, and what you need to do. So take ASEAN, for example. ASEAN is a very good example of trying to make forward movement in regional integration. Do you know that most companies do not use the ASEAN procedures to have duty-free movement of goods? Because it's simply too expensive to fill out the paperwork to certify that your product is 40% ASEAN regional content. It's much easier to pay the 4 or 5% tariff. So if you make this system so complicated, what you do is you work against your basic goal, which is to facilitate business. After all, when we talk about trade and investment, we're talking about big companies and small companies trying to serve consumer needs across the region. And so what I really object to is not the wasted expenditure on airlines, it's that this is actually creating a glut of bureaucracy and bureaucratic rules and procedures, and in some countries, which I won't mention, creating opportunities for corruption that simply make it more complex for business to operate. So I think here is really where this institutional proliferation has been detrimental to the central goal of creating an open trading and investment system that will benefit everyone. Honestly, I don't see why this is an Asian paradox at all. I mean, the United States has been trading with China for 20 years or more at a very high level. We have the Walmarts of the world and Cisco and Boeing and everybody investing in China. And yet people talk about conflict between the United States and China in various ways, and balancing behavior and security concerns and theft of intellectual property and this and that. And yet they merrily go ahead and keep trading. So if this was an Asian paradox, it should be specific to Asia. It's not. You have the US and China engaging in massive amounts of flows of capital, in massive amounts of flows in goods and services, and yet some people talk about China as the #1 enemy of the United States, and some Chinese talk about the United States as the #1 enemy of China. So it's clearly possible to move forward in the economic realm and still have severe political disputes. Right? So I'm not saying that security and trade are completely unlinked, because obviously security has some bearing on trade, and trade can have security implications. If one country is growing much faster than another because of trade, that may lead to security dilemmas for the country that's growing more slowly. So there are security elements to trade and economic matters. But to say that just because there are historical disputes or territorial disputes or security concerns, that therefore we should sit down, resolve everything before we have a trade agreement, doesn't seem logical to me, because historically that hasn't been the case. Historically, countries have made trade agreements, sometimes with countries that they're not particularly fond of. They may not be arch enemies, but even the US and Soviet Union cooperated on some issues, and nuclear proliferation issues, and SALT treaty and so on. So you can even cooperate with your arch enemy on certain issues. And so I don't believe that that alone should be an impediment. Right? So I don't find that entirely convincing. So I think I'm in some sense more optimistic that Asians can go forward with these trade agreements. And of course it would be great if these territorial disputes will be resolved, right? I mean, let's face it, some of these are over very small things, right? Okay, I know there's a 200-mile EEZ, I know that's very important for some countries, but at the end of the day, if you look at today's, for example, energy supply, the world is in complete transformation. The advent of shale oil will mean that the United States will be energy independent by 2025, energy independent. So to say that somehow we should be worrying about every single island dispute, and this is a matter of national pride, I think is misplacing what's really important for the people, right? Maybe this is important for the leaders to generate excitement and political support for particular, either left-wing or right-wing or extreme leadership of some kind. It serves their interest. It doesn't serve the people's interest to worry about this when there's so many sources of energy that are coming up, so many new technologies, and if you sit around and spend all your time talking about your differences and not enough time talking about how you can move forward in other issues, which is what I was talking about, delinkage, then I think it's really bad for you. And I think Asia, despite its amazing economic dynamism over the last 30 years, will be left behind eventually if, in fact, these conflicts continue to fester. And I think we've seen that, Chinese have lots of problems. They have an environmental problem. They have a demographic problem. The Indians have a problem of environmental issues as well. They have an inequality problem. That's true in China. That's true. Chinese Communist Party realizes there's an inequality problem in China. Indians realize that. Lots of countries have lots of problems. But if we sit around and say, okay, until we resolve every single historical dispute, until the Japanese apologize X number of times and the Koreans apologize and everybody should apologize to everybody else, I mean, this is a real waste of time. Right? I mean, this may be good politics, but it's terrible for the global economy, and I think it's up to these individual populations to say, we want leaders who don't spend all their time making political points and serve our needs and not their needs. Well, that's a mixed bag. There's a very well-known theory called commercial liberalism, which argues that growing trade and interdependence of economic interdependence leads to peace. And you also may know that there's a very famous book called The Great Illusion, written by Norman Angell in 1913, in which he argued that dramatic rise in interdependence among European countries would prevent conflict. And I don't want to end on a sour note, but as we know, 1914 was not exactly a good year for peace. So the notion that somehow growing economic interdependence is going to prevent conflict, it's a complicated issue. There's some evidence that that's the case. Again, to refer to my former student, Professor Mingyo Ku's at Seoul National University's work, he showed that a rapid rise in interdependence does lead to the de-escalation of island disputes. But to say that simply having a lot of trade investment will prevent war, I think is naive.